Red Hair on the Nile, the truth about Egyptian mummies. Egypt, land of pyramids, temples, and kings who thought marrying their sisters was the fast track to good genetics. Out of it came mummies, thousands of them, preserved like jerky for eternity. And when archaeologists unwrapped the mummies, what did they find? Not sub-Saharan princes, redheads, blondes, Ramesses. The second himself, the great conqueror, turns out to have been a ginger. Basically Eric the Red with a war chariot. Other mummies show the same. Fair hair, Mediterranean features, Near Eastern profiles. But today's mythmakers can't leave it there. The Egyptians were black, they shout. We was pharaohs. Netflix TV shows like Queen Cleopatra in their African Queens series line up with Afrocentric dreamers to tell us the Valley of the Kings was basically Harlem on the Nile. The pyramids, DIY projects from sub-Saharan Africa. Cleopatra, a Nubian queen. Tutankhamun, probably the first rapper. Now here's what the boring, racist little thing called evidence says. A 2017 DNA study of 90 mummies shows ancient Egyptians clustered with the Levant, Anatolia, and Europe, with less sub-Saharan ancestry than modern Egyptians. The first ever complete Old Kingdom genome, published in Nature this year, was 78% North African, 22% Mesopotamian, Y haplogroup, E1b1b, 0 sub-Saharan profile. Rosalie David's Manchester project confirmed it. Mediterranean traits, Near Eastern features, red and blonde hair. Over and over again. So where do the black pharaohs come in? From Nubia, south of Egypt. The Kushite 25th dynasty marched in during the 8th century BC, ruled for about 100 years, and then left. Outsiders, buried in Nubia, not Egypt. To pretend that makes all of ancient Egypt sub-Saharan is like claiming Britain was permanently Pakistani because you've got a curry house at the end of your street. And when the Greeks arrived, things got even less African. Alexander conquered, the Ptolemies took over, and for 3 centuries Egypt was run by Macedonian inbreds who spoke Greek and married their sisters until their family tree looked like a circle. But hey, according to some insecure people, we was pharaohs. The Great Tudor Diversity Hoax. Once upon a time, in the golden age of England, when Henry VIII was chopping off wives' heads like it was a weekend hobby, and Elizabeth I was turning a small island into the envy of Europe, there were the Tudors, pale-faced monarchs painted into history. That's the story you'd think everybody knew. But no, enter the BBC, who never miss a chance to announce yet another hidden history. And then along comes Dr. Miranda Kaufman, the kind of left-wing historian who thinks she's rewriting history when really she's just wiping her bottom with parish registers and calling it scholarship. She spent years digging through dust and cobwebs, and what did she find? About as much diversity in Tudor England as you'll find in a BNP meeting. Kaufman herself hilariously admits, over the next few years, I found evidence of over 200 Africans living in Tudor England. They appear in parish registers, tax returns, household accounts, court records, wills, diaries, and letters. 200 Africans across an entire century, scattered thinly across a kingdom of 2 to 3 million people. 200, that's 0.01% of the population. Statistically invisible. A rounding error. They could all have caught the plague on a Tuesday, and the country wouldn't even have noticed. And then there's the title, Black Tudors. Not one of them was a Tudor. The Tudors were the royal dynasty. Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I. Pale-skinned monarchs whose faces hang in every gallery. These Africans weren't Tudors. They weren't rulers. They weren't dukes or queens. At best, they were servants, porters, or curiosities scribbled into the margins of history. Calling them Tudors is like calling a plumber who once fixed a leaky tap in Buckingham Palace a Windsor. But of course that's the point. Nobody's desperate to say, they was Ottomans or was Mongols. No, it's always us. Because deep down, even the critics know, the Tudors weren't just monarchs, they were the benchmark. Who wouldn't want to steal a piece of our glory? So we get the Jacques Francis tale, an African diver who helped salvage the Mary Rose. A brave enough story, sure, but in the modern retelling, this single diver somehow transforms Tudor England into a multicultural utopia. And the Black Tudors gallery? One portrait. John Blanke, the trumpeter. One man, one painting, recycled endlessly like he was the Duke of Norfolk himself. Beyond that, silence. No Afro-Tudor aristocracy, no portraits of black earls or duchesses, because they didn't exist. And so, with a kingdom of millions ruled by pale Tudor monarchs, remembered for its brilliance and swagger, and with a modern myth that twists a handful of curiosities into a fairy tale of diversity. Next time someone insists the Tudors were black, just remind them there were more lepers than Africans in Tudor England. But hey, according to the BBC, we was Tudors. The Messiah was a rabbi, not a Rasta. Jesus of Nazareth, if he existed at all, was born to Mary and Joseph, 2 Jews from Galilee, which means, shock of shocks, he would have looked like a Jew. Olive skin, dark hair, Semitic features, the same face you'd see on half the blokes haggling over fish in a 1st century Jerusalem market. Nothing exotic, nothing sub-Saharan, just another Galilean with a beard and a bad diet. And yet, 2,000 years later, along comes the headlines. Forget Jewish rabbi, suddenly he's recast as a kind of African revolutionary, smuggled into Galilee like he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere south of the Sahara. Apparently, Joseph was a carpenter by day, but in his spare time moonlighted as a father in Uganda. Enter 𝐬𝐵𝐾𝐿𝐵 in 1968, who wrote The Black Messiah. Suddenly Jesus is no longer a Jewish rabbi from Galilee, he's an African Che Guevara with sandals, leading the revolution against Rome. A few years later, James Cone arrives, insisting Christ was basically Malcolm X with parables. The Nation of Islam nod approvingly, Rastafarians set it to a reggae beat, and by the time we reach the 21st century, the myth has gone global. Jesus was black, case closed. So, what's the evidence? Revelation 1:14-15. Hair like wool, feet like burnished bronze. And here's where the scam comes in. The text says his hair was white like wool, not textured like it. It's a metaphor for purity and radiance, not a 1st century afro. As for the feet like bronze, that's not a skin tone. It's describing something glowing hot, like metal pulled from a furnace. In other words, the writer is sketching a supernatural vision. Blazing eyes, shining limbs, stars in his hand, a sword coming out of his mouth, yet somehow modern retellings strip all the cosmic imagery away and pretend it's a mugshot. Hair like wool must mean black, bronze feet must mean dark skin. The reality? If he lived, Jesus was a Galilean Jew. Archaeology of the period show this. Skeletons from Judea in the 1st century show Mediterranean Semitic traits, not a trace of sub-Saharan Africa. So the facts, as dull as they are, if he lived, Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jew from Galilee, not Nordic, not African, just an olive-skinned rabbi who annoyed the Romans enough to get himself crucified. But hey, according to modern activists, we was Jesus's. 3 centuries of cousin marriages don't make you African. Once there was Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, descendant of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks who'd been squatting in Egypt for 3 centuries, marrying their cousins, speaking Greek, and keeping themselves about as Egyptian as a plate of souvlaki. By the time Cleopatra VII came along, the family tree looked less like a lineage and more like a hazard warning. Inbreeding this dense should have come with a skull and crossbones. Forget Elizabeth Taylor. After 3 centuries of cousins marrying cousins, Cleopatra probably looked less like a goddess and more like something you'd scrape off the bottom of a sandal. The idea that she was a great beauty is laughable. So where does the Black Cleopatra myth come from? Sally Ann Ashton talks utter nonsense in her book Cleopatra and Egypt. She admits Cleopatra was, of course, part Greek. Ashton writes, Cleopatra was of course part Greek, but the identity of her paternal grandmother is unknown, leaving open the possibility of an Egyptian or even an African ancestry. She dangles the one flimsy thread that the whole Afrocentric myth hangs on. We don't know who Cleopatra's paternal grandmother was. That's it. The entire Cleopatra was black claim boils down to a missing name in the family register. Absolutely mental. Because if you follow that logic, every time there's a gap in a family tree, you're free to fill it with whatever you like. Don't know who your great-grandmother was? Well, maybe she was Nubian royalty. Apparently, in modern academia, absence of evidence is not only evidence, it's a free pass to write fan fiction with a bibliography. Ashton herself admits the appeal. Cleopatra seems to bring European and African cultures together, which in practice meant she was Greek by blood, possibly had a dash of local Egyptian ancestry, and chose to dress up like Isis so her subjects would take her seriously. The facts are obvious. Cleopatra's ancestry is overwhelmingly Macedonian Greek. The poor African claim hangs by a single grandmother nobody can identify, and that's utter desperation. But hey, according to Netflix, we was Cleopatra's. Beethoven didn't come from Lagos, he came from Bonn. Look at a map, you muppets. Ludwig van Beethoven, born in Bonn, December 1770. Baptised in St. Remigius Church. His father Johann, a tenor in the Bonn Court Chapel, more famous for being a drunk who beat little Ludwig half to death to make him practice. His mother, Maria Magdalena, a Rhineland woman from a respectable German family. His grandfather Ludwig, a Flemish bass singer and Kapellmeister from Mechelen, that's in the Duchy of Brabant, in what is now Belgium. Beethoven's family were from Brabant in the Flemish Low Countries. His grandfather Ludwig had come from Mechelen to Bonn. So let's be precise. Flemish blood, German upbringing, Viennese training, a European family tree through and through. Not exactly Lagos. And here's the thing. The Germans should be proud of this. A people who gave us Beethoven, Bach, Goethe, brothers to the English in culture, language and history, yet because of the shadow of World War II, Germans are forever taught to hang their heads. Enough of that. Beethoven is proof of what Germany really stands for. Brilliance, discipline, genius, born of struggle. So where does the myth come from? From the mind of a lunatic, obviously, but let's humour it. In 1907, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, a mixed-race English composer, pushed the idea. But why, I hear you ask? Because some of Beethoven's contemporaries described him as having a dark complexion and coarse hair. Why did they think this? Because a few descriptions called Beethoven swarthy or dark. But in 18th century German, that didn't mean African. It meant sallow, scarred, sickly. The man had smallpox as a child that left him badly marked, later drank himself into liver disease, and spent most of his life looking like he'd lost a fight with a coal scuttle. As Swafford puts it, he was short, stocky, dark complexioned from his Flemish ancestry, and marked by smallpox. Add in his Flemish-German genetics, where ruddy or olive complexions were common, plus a lifestyle of filth, stress, and not bathing, and you get exactly what his neighbours described, a rough, unhealthy-looking European. Only a low IQ pleb could mistake that for proof of African royalty. Then in the 1940s, Joel Augustus Rogers took the ball and sprinted off a cliff with it. He quoted phrases like swarthy, coal-black hair, and even called Beethoven a Moor. Never mind that Moor back then meant anything from a Spaniard to a slightly tanned Italian. Rogers declared it proof Beethoven was black. By the 1960s, Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael picked it up, not as history, but as metaphor. It was meant as provocation. If even Beethoven was black, then your whole history is a lie. Fine as theatre, useless as scholarship, and by 2020, the whole thing had been boiled down into a meme. Beethoven was black, shouted by people who couldn't pick Bonn out on a map if you paid them. In 2023, scientists sequenced Beethoven's genome from authenticated hair samples, and surprise, surprise, overwhelmingly European. Flemish, German, nothing African. The biggest discovery wasn't his skin colour, it was that he probably had liver disease, which isn't surprising given he drank like a fish and half his wine came marinated in lead from the barrels. So why cling to the myth? Because Beethoven is the benchmark. He's the symbol of genius through suffering. Almost deaf towards the end of his life, half mad, living in squalor, yet producing the Ninth Symphony. And who wouldn't want to steal a piece of that? If you can't compose like Beethoven, the next best thing is to hijack his ethnicity. So the Germans, our brothers, should hold their heads high for producing him. But hey, according to some, we woos Beethovens. We was O'Neills, the myth of the Black Irish, Ireland, rain, potatoes, fiddles, and DNA that screams Bronze Age Bell Beaker. These were steplads who rocked up around 2200 BC, booted out the Neolithic farmers, and left the genetic stamp that still defines the Irish today. As Ross Byrne and colleagues write in Insular Celtic Population Structure and Genomic Footprints of Migration, it is not until after the demographic upheavals of the early Bronze Age that strong genetic continuity between ancient and modern Irish populations is observed. In short, your ancestors were hairy Bronze Age warriors, not lost cousins of Snoop Dogg. And who wouldn't want to claim that? The Irish gave the world saints, scholars, poets, and pubs. Half of America wishes it was Irish every March 17, so of course somebody's going to try to nick the brand. But here come the modern geniuses. A handful of Mesolithic skeletons with darker skin pop up, hunter-gatherers who lived 4,000 years before Ireland even was Ireland. And suddenly, Facebook explodes. Did you know the Irish were melanated? Viral memes, Afrocentric dreamers, and a Channel 4-style documentary, The Burren Heart of Stone, solemnly announced that Ireland was once Africa with Guinness. The stupidity writes itself. These early hunter-gatherer males were mostly wiped out by the Bell Beaker arrivals. Meanwhile, the real science, the Irish DNA Atlas, shows modern Irish relate directly to Bronze Age beaker samples from Rathlin Island, steppe ancestry, European links, continuity for 3,500 years. As Edmund Gilbert and colleagues state in the Irish DNA Atlas, studies of ancient Irish genomes suggest that the modern Irish genetic landscape was established about 3,500 years ago in the Irish Bronze Age. No sub-Saharan profile? Not then, not now. The actual Afrocentric claim rests on one line: Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, dark skin, blue eyes, pre-Irish, pre-Beaker, gone forever. It's like claiming the French are actually hobbits because Neanderthals once lived in caves in Dordogne. So, people don't try to be cultures that have no impact. They want to be Irish because the Irish matter, from building half of New York to writing half of the Western canon. That's why the myth exists in the first place. If you want Black Irish, the best you'll get is a pint of stout. But hey, according to certain black nationalists, we was O'Neills.